and you can link to both through our website, ppld.org. Barbara O'Neill is the Washington Post and Amazon charts best-selling author of more than a dozen titles, including The Art of Inheriting Secrets, How to Bake a Perfect Life, and the #1 Kindle bestseller, When We Believed in Mermaids. She lives in Colorado Springs with her partner, a British endurance athlete, and their small zoo of rescue animals. Her newest book is The Lost Girls of Devon. Her books are published internationally, and her book, The Lost Recipe for Happiness, won the highly prestigious Rita Award from the Romance Writers of America. Kirkus Reviews has said of her books on the art of inheriting secrets, great writing, terrific characters, food elements, romance, a touch of intrigue, and more than a few surprises to keep readers guessing. And Booklists writes, an engaging storyteller who excels at creating memorable characters through crisp dialogue, unveiling a poignant humanity, and a sublime sensitivity for the fragile nature of complex family relationships. So, Barbara O'Neill, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I also see some friendly faces, so hi, and thanks for coming. If you see blue fingerprints, it's because I was messing with a fountain pen before I got here. My fountain pen fell all apart, and now my fingers are stained blue, which is kind of the story of my life at the moment. But anyway, what a year, right? I think all of us are feeling off-center and a little bit lost, or maybe that's only me. For a while, I wasn't sure what I was going to even talk to you about because everything seems small in contrast to the enormity of everything that's happening in the world, right? But then I remembered, we love books. I love books. You love books. This is a place where we can come together and take a breath. I am a writer. I love writing novels. I am truly one of the luckiest people on the planet because this is all I ever wanted from the first time I understood that writing novels was a job. I wanted to grow up and write stories. I kind of thought, like, if that is a job, why would you pick something else? But the dream started because first I loved reading. One of my earliest memories is trying to explain to my mother why I needed to take a collection of fairy tales with me to the drive-in. I can still feel that cool slick cover under my arm and my relief when she said, yes. Some other mothers might have said with some justification, we're going to a movie. You don't need a book too. But my mom was also a book lover and she understood. Whenever we went anywhere, I had to have a book with me. It didn't matter that I might not read the book of fairy tales, but I needed to have that security of something to read just in case. In case of what? You probably all know this feeling. Well, in case the people are boring, in case we get stuck somewhere, in case, I don't know, anything. I still need a book with me at all times, and I'm sure many of you do too. Luckily, we can now tuck hundreds of books into our pockets. I love paper books and I still read them, but digital books made my life a whole lot easier. It made my shoulders happier when I wasn't carting around a purse full of 2 or 3 books, or a backpack full of 6 or 7 books, or a suitcase that barely had any shoes or clothes in it, only books, just in case, just in case. Now I tuck them all the way into my phone or my tablet, although there is still a spare paper book in my purse or my bag or my car, because what if I lose power? What if, and I did this once, I break the screen of my reader on the way to a 3-week vacation. I had a 9-hour flight from Denver to England and nothing to read the whole way. The minute I arrived at my husband's village, I told him we had to go to the Oxfam charity store and find some books pronto, and we did. Books are my comfort and my vice and my most ardent pleasure. The past month, I've had to move the books out of my office 3 times. It's a long story why it was 3 times, but I took advantage of the moment to thin them out a little bit. And really, is there anything more pleasurable than going through your books? So many eras of my life and my career are stacked up on those shelves right behind me. The medieval period dating back to the mid-90s, when I was obsessed with the 14th century Death and how to run a medieval castle and village. My obsession came about because my uncle, a deep book geek himself, gave me a distant mirror for Christmas one year, and I fell into that era with a wild dive. I don't currently write about the medieval era, but I will never part with a distant mirror. Dipping into it, I opened the pages and read rumors of a terrible plague supposedly arising in China and spreading through Central Asia to India and Persia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, all of Asia Minor, had reached Europe in 1346. They told of a death toll so devastating that all of India was said to be depopulated, whole territories covered by dead bodies, other areas with no one left alive. As added up by Pope Clement VI at Avignon, the total of reported dead reached 23,843,000. In the absence of a concept of contagion, no serious alarm was felt in Europe until the trading ships brought their black burden of pestilence into Messina, while other infected ships from the Levant carried it into Genoa and Venice. Aside, because I am such a nerd, when I read this paragraph again for this talk, I realized that it referenced India, which I'd never really thought about India and the plague. And I'll get into my India thing in a minute. But I immediately had to stop reading and figuring out this talk and go look up the Black Death and India. And that took me down a rabbit hole of research that gave me a very, very juicy idea that I can't wait to explore by ordering more books, more. My husband always knows when I'm working on a new idea because the house fills up with books on strange and esoteric subjects. When I fell in love with surfing, and specifically women in surfing, I wrote it as part of the backstory in When We Believe in Mermaids. And my house was completely littered for months with books about the surfing life, the mystique of surfing, memoirs about surfing, surfing everywhere, every kind of angle of surfing possible. Which is why I eventually have to thin the books in my office. If I kept them all, I'd never even have a place to sit. But I assume that other people get some pleasure from them when I pass them on, so I'm okay with it. Anyway, back to A Distant Mirror, which was a book I fell madly in love with and read repeatedly. Mostly because I also have a penchant for the workings of infectious diseases. I was really fascinated with the Black Death and its horrific power to completely remake society. I read everything I could find on the subject, learning about things like smallpox and cholera, those very cheerful things along the way. And eventually I produced 3 medieval novels that are all influenced by the massive changes happening in society at that time because of the Black Death. In one of them, a serf takes advantage of the upheaval to present himself as a knight to the world. And because a castle and a village have been abandoned, he finds a way to make that true. When COVID-19 showed up and we all had to quarantine, I felt the terror that we all felt. Right at the beginning, when so many of my New York friends were sending photos and stories about the horrific cost of the virus in the city, excuse me, it seemed that we might all be carried away. I read a lot, as I'm sure many of you did, running away into other worlds and places where it wasn't such a horror. I also picked up another one of my favorite books, one that I've read probably 6 or 7 times, Connie Willis's The Doomsday Book. She's also a Colorado writer, by the way. I'd forgotten that it starts with a new flu virus attacking Oxford during the Christmas season in a near future time, like 2040 or something like that. A time traveler sent back to the Black Death by accident, and the 2 stories of flu in this near future world and the Black Death in the 14th century are told side by side. And the cost in both worlds is cataclysmic. It's bittersweet even at the end, a powerful story of our mortality as a species and of our vulnerability as a species. Now it seems that a novel like that would be a poor choice for the start of such an uncertain period in our own lives, but it was actually a good choice for me. Reading took me away, first of all, but it also connected me to humanity and history. Pandemics are not new. I knew that intellectually, but the Doomsday Book connected me to that reality on a visceral, emotional level. I'm only one woman living in an uncertain time, and I am like many other women through history and women who will live after me. It's terrible and sad, this moral coil, but it's also exceedingly beautiful and rich, and I should appreciate every second of it. To love books is to fall in love with the world. One of the other books I found on my bookshelves and could not resist taking down to read again was Susanna Moore's One Last Look. It's a historical novel about an 18th century woman traveling to India with her brother and sister, and there are many layers to it about colonialism and the subjugation of women. But at the very heart, it's the story of India seducing this very uptight and lonely English woman. Slowly and inexorably, we, the reader, fall in love right along with her. It's such a powerful tale that I found myself dreaming of India at night, waking to the taste of mangoes in my mouth. Now, I have wanted to visit India since my uncle, same uncle who gave me a distant mirror, went there when I was a young teen. His stories and the ways that he was visibly changed stuck with me, and I fell in love with the magic, the promise, and the challenge of that country. Every time I traveled with Susanna Moore to her India, I longed to go there myself again. And because I am a writer, I had to examine this book to see how she pulled it off. What signals did she give me? What could I glean from such luscious writing? India is completely a character in this book. And the sense of place is almost leaping off the page. Now, I teach this book, so I think some of you have heard this passage before, so just enjoy it again. I have to take a drink for this one, has a lot of S's. White Persian cats sprawled limply on the lawn, the tips of their tongues dripping from their mouths. Screens of white silk had been erected near a trellis of withered sweet peas for the native ladies who kept purdah. Native musicians sat on the floor of the veranda, playing Neapolitan love songs. Several of Miss Beecham's comely wards were engaged in an archery contest on the lawn. A young prince, girlish, scented, delicate, dressed in gold tissue and brocade, and said to be a favorite of the Dowager Begum of Carano, strolled back and forth, the toes of his curled slippers just visible in the parched grass, surreptitiously glancing at the girls as they struggled to tighten their bows. The beautiful Mrs. Langley was there, affecting to be much naughtier than there is the slightest call for, accompanied, it is true, by a bejangled negress who stalked proudly behind her. Quite understandably, Mrs. Langley has a look of exhaustion about her, as everyone who meets her falls in love with her. The extraordinary ingenuity that is required to maintain her impartiality must take its toll. Now, I can travel to India in this book and travel back in time too, and be someone else for a while. And myself too, longing for a place I've never been. That's part of the power of books. It's magnificent, it's incredible, it's crazy that we can do this. One day that uncle of mine died rather suddenly, and I dipped into One Last Look, sort of missing him and thinking about him. And I wondered when I would make that pilgrimage myself. No one ever wanted to go with me, so I finally screwed up my courage and went on my own January before last. It was hard. It was actually overwhelming. It was magnificent and seductive, and I really can't wait to go again when COVID has run its course. I hope I can. But in the meantime, I can read books about India now, and books about India in the past, and now books about the Black Death invading India, not in the Middle Ages, end of the 19th century, which I have just discovered while getting ready to talk to you. This is the best thing about books. They offer us the entire world. With cell phones and digital books, now every person in the world can theoretically have access to all the books that have ever been written. Think of that. Just think. Think of all the dreams that might be born, the new things that might be invented. It gives me shivers. As a blue-collar girl living in Colorado Springs neighborhood, the rest of the world seemed far away and mostly out of reach to me. But I traveled in the books I checked out of the library, traveled to England and to the Painted Desert and to Egypt and South Africa and Siam. I went anywhere I wanted to go by only opening the cover of a book. All the world was right there for me in the local library. That's what reading does. It raises our awareness of connection. It gives us a sense of the broader world. Aristotle said that when we watch a tragedy, two emotions predominate: pity for the character and fear for yourself. Without necessarily even noticing, we imagine what it's like to be them and compare their reactions to situations with how we responded in the past or imagine that we might in the future. This is one of the reasons that it is so important to make sure that diverse voices are given space in traditional publishing, and why we as readers really must make a priority to read those diverse voices. If we wish to create a just and moral world for all of our citizens, and I think almost all of us do, we need to be able to peer into the various lives in our society, people who might be just like us and people who might not be at all like us. When I was 18, I lived in a house over on Iowa Street. It was practically the last house left in an area going to industry, but we were very young and had no money, and the house was very nice with wood floors and 2 bedrooms and a big kitchen and a front porch where we had beers and enjoyed the dusk. I was already at that time trying to figure out how to be a writer. I wasn't in college because I didn't see how I could afford it, but I knew I wanted to write fiction. Armed with the advice and guidance of Writer's Digest magazine, I was trying to develop good habits, writing every day or at least regularly, sending out my work to magazines without, it must be said, any idea of how the market worked. I was working on a novel, a dark and angsty love story that was a perfect vehicle for an 18-year-old romantic to express her emotions. I mostly received form rejections, but an editor at 17 magazine liked one story enough to write a personal note, which I actually knew was a really big deal. That single note kept me going for literally years. No one from a giant magazine would write a personal note to a writer that was no good, right? Sorry, there's trucks today. I was, at that time, the only person who believed in my writing. So if you're that person now and no one believes except you, just keep going. Anyway, back to the story of books, and specifically diversity in books. In the basement of that house on Iowa, I found a box of abandoned books that included Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, The Prison Letters of George Jackson, the autobiography of Angela Davis, and several others. One of them I still have. Battered and yellowed, the pages crumbling because it rocked my world. American Negro Poetry, published in 1963, introduced me to dozens of Black poets and poetry. To my great surprise, not all of them were about race or being Black or slavery or any of those things. There are sonnets and odes to the end of love, poems about the brutality of war and the delight of dawn. I was entirely captured by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and some of his poems gave me titles for 2 of my books, A Minute to Smile, which comes from the poem Light, and The Sleeping Night, which comes from the simple, lovely poem Dawn. Dunbar is also the author of a poem that gave a title to another very famous book. The poem is Sympathy, and it begins, I know what the caged bird feels, alas. Those found books opened my eyes to a reality I'd never dreamed of and changed my life in significant ways. I sought out and studied Black writers and Latina writers and radical women, all who told a truth that I really needed to hear when I was trying to become myself. Powerful things, wise things, serious things. But when it came time for me to write novels myself, I couldn't find a place to tell my stories. I was living in a little house in Pueblo with a garden, 2 little boys, and a husband who consumed his weight in calories every day. I managed to work my way through college, working a restaurant job at night, taking internships and scholarships, and sharing rent with a series of roommates. I studied journalism and became editor of the school paper and wrote a column that brought me the attention that I craved for my work. I learned that I did not want to write for a newspaper. I wanted to write novels. I burned to write novels. And so despite all the naysayers who were sure I was throwing away a perfectly good opportunity, I stuck with restaurants for another 5 years to write my books, or at least try. I loved that period of my life. I loved being a mother. I loved being the center of a peaceful home. I loved the homely arts of baking bread and making jam. I won prizes for my breads at the state fair and won my mother's attention by finding so much pleasure in domesticity. I wanted to write about plum jam and happiness and the power in motherhood and the longings to fulfill what I still thought of as my destiny. I knew I was meant to be a writer, and I had to figure out how to make that happen. I wrote short stories and articles and entered contests, but despite the kind rejections, and encouragement that I received, I wasn't making any progress. I knew I was a commercial writer, not a literary writer, but at that time there was no genre equivalent to the books that I write now. Books about women's lives, all parts of it, from sisters to mothers and daughters, domestic books about marriage or finding a vocation. I had nowhere to sell the books that I really wanted to write. I had to do something, somehow, to make money writing, or I'd be back at the newspaper. My sister suggested that I write romance novels. We'd read a million of them as teenagers babysitting for a woman who subscribed to like 5 different services, Harlequin Presents, Harlequin, all of them. I thought, as so many before me have, how hard could it be? Well, I'm going to tell you, it's easy to write a really bad romance novel, or a bad novel in any genre, honestly. It's really hard to write a good one. After I tossed one really awful cliched romance, I doubled back and really studied the genre. I took the books apart to see where the turning points were, what kind of expectations needed to be met. And then I set about trying to write something original in my voice about my world as a romance novel. What I discovered was that I could write about a woman's life in a romance novel, and by extension, her friends and her mother and her family. I could write about vocation and work and what it means for a woman to have a happy life. And that work piece has become such a huge part of what I write about that I think it's funny that that was the first thing that was in that book. I can also write about falling in love and about good men and how people come together. I loved it. I loved that book. The novel that I poured my heart into, that second romance novel that I tried hard to make a good romance, was about creativity and music and a dying steel town and 2 weary people finding each other. It was set in Colorado, and there were Vietnam veterans and a terrible tragedy in the past and 2 people who fall in love imperfectly and with gusto. I sent it back to an editor who had encouraged me with the first book. Just before Thanksgiving that year, we all had the flu. My boys, me, everyone around us. We didn't have a phone because the steel mill crash had taken down the economy around Pueblo, and I had to put my dad's phone number on everything that I sent out for submission. Well, that day, my dad arrived at the door to tell me that an editor had called and wanted me to call her back. I sold that novel. It was, at the time, it was a $4,000 advance, which seemed like a ridiculous sum of money at the time. I felt like Cinderella, as if everything I'd ever dreamed of had come true. Then I went to bed with a fever and stayed there for 3 days. And when I woke up, I thought it was a dream. It wasn't. Someone said to me, well, now you've proved yourself. Even if you never sell another book, you've done it once. And I was absolutely petrified. What if that happened? What if I was 80, looking back on my lone published novel? That would be horrible. So I got busy. 6 months later, I sold another romance, and 6 months after that, another. And from that day to this, I have been writing novels as a job, as a passion, as a vocation. I am also still a reader, a most passionate and devoted reader. I still read between 50 and 70 books a year, every year, all kinds of books, nonfiction and memoir, romances and thrillers, and of course, women's fiction, which finally did evolve into the genre that we know today. After writing nearly 20 romances, I tried my hand at general fiction about and for women within the Midnight Rain, which was published in 1999. Many of those books take readers around the world. My recent novels have carried them to a crumbling manor house in England, and to New Zealand and Santa Cruz and the coast of the West Country in England. I do it on purpose, knowing that my purpose, my calling, is to give a weary reader a break and an escape. In a world that sometimes seems to be falling apart around us, my job is to create worlds where things fall apart but can also be mended again. The Lost Girls of Devon, just out in July, is about such a world. And a reviewer wrote of Lost Girls a paragraph that I think sums up really well what I do overall. Barbara O'Neill specializes in novels featuring broken women who are forced to gather their strength and regroup. They are realistic, believable characters who've been hurt or have hurt others. It's O'Neill's role to show women who grow stronger, who heal, who find strength in other women. The Lost Girls of Devon on the surface is the story of several women who've gone missing. It's actually a heartbreaking and heartwarming story of lost girls who need the support of other women. When I first read that, I got really choked up because I thought that she had just really got it, like so clearly what it is that I'm trying to do. Being able to write novels about the struggle of women to be whole is really like winning the lottery for me. I've had the struggles and tragedies that every human being has to face, but through it all, I've also had this work that I love. I love reading and I love that escape, but writing is like reading on steroids. Writing a book extends the amount of time that you're immersed in the book world. And during this pandemic, which feels at the moment as if it will like never end, I have found a really great solace in writing. I've lived this whole year in a beautiful apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a world where the pandemic has never happened, but sisters who are at war can learn to love each other again. In writing and reading, we heal each other and ourselves. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening. I am happy to take your questions.
And thank you very much, Barbara, for that wonderfully insightful, inspiring, and relevant speech. I wish we could hear the cascade of applause for you right now. That truly was a magnificent talk there, enjoyed by all. And we will indeed check out some questions for you here. First one is from Holly, and it is asked, how do you think this COVID-19 period we are experiencing will affect your writing style, topics, and/or choice of characters, if at all?
You know, that is a really good question. And I can't imagine that there isn't a writer on this planet that isn't thinking about that right now. It does seem as if eventually we're going to have to include it in our narratives, but at the moment we don't know how it's going to play out. So making any kind of guess could be really wrong, and then the reader will never be able to be immersed. So I think it's going to be a while before I personally try to tackle the subject on any level.
And our next question from Denise is to please tell us the name of the book that you had mentioned in your talk about India.
Okay, it is One Last Look by Susanna Moore. It is a lovely, lovely book. That might actually be the best term for it. It's just a great book. You should read it.
And again, to all of our participants out there, if you have any questions for Barbara O'Neill, please put them in the chat box and we will get to them shortly. Our next question is from Tracy, and it's asked, what is the name of the book you wrote that got attention that time during Thanksgiving? I guess during Thanksgiving season one year, a book you wrote got great attention. Could you share the title, please?
Right, that would have been my first book that I sold, and it was called Strangers on a Train. And I warn you, if you find this book, it has a beautiful cover. The woman has really long, blonde hair, and I was so happy when I saw it. But the hero smokes. Now, this was 1989, so it was perfectly normal at that time, but I've actually never re-released it just because it seems horrifying. But that's the book, Strangers on a Train.
And the next question is, have you traveled to the places that you have written about?
I have traveled mostly to all of them. I've actually never been to Santa Cruz, but I've been in the general area of Santa Cruz, and I've spent a lot of time in Northern and Central California. So I was able to extrapolate, but mostly I have. The reason that I usually want to write about a place is because I fall in love with it and I want to share it with the world. When we went to Devon last spring, I just was smitten by the West Country and how beautiful it was and how filled with myth and magic, and it's staggeringly beautiful visually. So, I mean, I couldn't resist setting a book there.
And during your speech, you had touched on a couple of contemporary themes in there, especially the need for diverse books for diverse audiences. In that respect, who are some of your favorite contemporary authors, regardless of genre? Who do you feel like writes good fiction or nonfiction these days?
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this according to the diversity question. Some of my favorite writers are, I've actually been reading a lot of Indian authors because I am obsessed with Indian writers at the moment. And I have to look at my screen to say like exactly who, but one of the writers I really like in romantic fiction is Sonali Dev. I think she's really funny, and I think she has a great writing style. Such a Fun Age is a book that I read recently, and her name escapes me. The author's name escapes me. But that is a very good novel. Some of the other people I've been reading, you know what, I should always prepare for this ahead of time, and I never do, because the minute you ask me what I've been reading, I can't remember a single thing. I'm going to find that name for you, though. Such a Fun Age. I can't find it. It's a very recent book. Such a Fun Age, Kylie Reed. There you go. That was her name. I'm looking at all my books on. So.
Okay. You had mentioned that when you were living in Pueblo, it sounded like your first or one of your first books were inspired by what was happening in the community at that time. Do you have any books that you have written that have taken place in the Pikes Peak region or are influenced by the Pikes Peak region, its geography, its people, its situation?
I have. I'm actually a third generation native of Colorado Springs. So it's like really, it's kind of a part of everything that I write, because that mountain range and the way the landscape is really influences everything I think about place. And it's why I find a sense of place so important. One of the most important books that I've written was How to Bake a Perfect Life, which is set over on the west side of Colorado Springs. And it features some of the local restaurants, and it's really about that west side feeling. There are others, but that's the main one.
Oh, very good. And to our participants, again, if you have any more questions, please place them into the chat box. We'll take a couple of more here, a couple of more questions before ending our program today. Have you used India as a setting for one of your books?
It tends to be something that's far away or distant. I did use it partially, Udaipur especially in India, which I visited last year, as the place where the mother ran away to many years ago. So it sort of runs through the book, but I don't feel that I have enough of an understanding of the country to be able to write about it as a setting yet. I had originally had a plan to go to India and go down the Ganges River in November, but it's not happening this year. It's probably not happening next year either. So probably that will take a little time, but I really do hope someday I know enough about India to feel comfortable at least doing something with it.
Fantastic. And I'll share with our participants here, I'm sure it's no great secret, and that you also write books under the name of Barbara Samuel. And all of the books you have written, is there one book that you really have liked, that you feel was one of your better, or if not the best book you have written, that really didn't get the recognition or didn't get the audience that you feel it deserved?
The Garden of Happy Endings is absolutely that book. I feel that it was a very strong, mature book. I feel like I was really understanding how to write a novel and how to get certain ideas on the page. And I don't know why, partly maybe because the main character was a minister who had lost her faith. So people kind of went, oh, it's probably like, you know, like a religious book or something. It just really did not get the audience I felt that it should have had. So that's the one, The Garden of Happy Endings.
The Garden of Happy Endings. So you have websites for both Barbara O'Neill and Barbara Samuel and somebody just commented Garden of Happy Endings is their favorite book. So very good. And so you do have websites that our participants can check out to find more about you and your books. Both, if you could share those with us, please.
Okay, the Barbara O'Neill is www.barbarao'neill.com, and the other is barbarasamuel.com.
Absolutely. Kathleen asks, do you feel that when you wrote romance books, you were able to write on issues important to women beyond romance?
I absolutely do. And one of the reasons that I finally decided that that was what I wanted to do was because the hand that rocks the cradle rocks the world. That old expression, that if I really wanted to create awareness about issues and ideas that were important to me, that the way to do it was in an accessible and approachable way, which would sometimes be like a romance novel. One of them talks about, Rain Singer talks about domestic violence, and so does The Last Chance Ranch. And I know that several people have told me that they started volunteering at women's shelters and understood the issues better by like reading those books. So yeah, I think it's really possible to do a lot of that in romance novels.
And Holly comments that she remembers Ruth Wind.
Yes, Ruth Wind. That would be who wrote those books.
Oh, one of your first pseudonyms. Very good. Well, looks like we're drawing to an end with our time here today. And I'd like to, again, encourage all of our participants. I'm sure most of them have already checked out your newest book, The Lost Girls of Devon. And the comment about this book from Reese Bowen was, it is written in exquisite prose with the added bonus of the small Devon village as a setting. Barbara O'Neill's book will ensnare the reader from the first page, taking us on an emotional journey of love, loss, and betrayal. So if you haven't already, please check out your favorite bookseller or your library. Surely a wonderful read ahead of you there. So any last comments from Barbara O'Neill?
No, I'm just very thankful to be here, and thanks for having me. And it isn't the way we definitely want to do it, but like maybe next year we'll all be together in person. So thanks for coming.
Again, yes, thank you everyone for attending today. Our extreme appreciation to Barbara O'Neill for this time spent with us, this wonderful and insightful time. We look forward to the day when we're all able to join in again. Hopefully at one of the future Mountain of Author programs, we'll be able to welcome you in person. So Barbara O'Neill, thank you very much. And to everyone out there, thank you for attending today. Please check out ppld.org/MOA for future Mountain of Author events and programs and a recording of today's program.